My name is Evelyn Caraway. I'm 68 years old. The morning the invitations arrived. Charleston was wrapped in that soft spring light that makes everything look forgiving. The water on the harbor, the old pastel houses, even the cracks in the sidewalk. I remember standing by the window, holding a heavy ivory envelope between my fingers, the gold lettering pressed deep into the paper. Mr. and Mrs. Livingston request the honor of your presence at the marriage of their daughter Claire to Adam Caraway. My son's name looked beautiful printed in that elegant script. It should have filled me with pride. Instead, a faint unease ran beneath the admiration, like a thread pulled too tight. The envelope felt expensive, deliberate. I knew it would because I had paid for it. 2 months earlier, Adam had called me from his office in Atlanta. "Mom," he'd said in that clipped, cheerful tone he used whenever he was about to ask for something big. The Livingstons found a local printer who does luxury invitations, real foil embossing, imported stock. Everything. They're $5 a piece. But it's worth it. I laughed softly. Because of course I would say yes. Send me the invoice. I told him. We'll make sure it's perfect. $5 a piece had turned into $9 after the upgrades. There were 500 invitations in total. I didn't tell him I hesitated before wiring the money. I didn't tell him that I'd sold a small mutual fund I'd been keeping for repairs on the house. It was easier to imagine his happiness than to think about the balance on my account. The box of finished invitations came to my address instead of his. When I lifted the lid, the scent of new paper rose like perfume. The envelopes were heavy enough to make your wrist ache if you held them too long. It was the kind of detail that impressed people like the Livingstons. I stacked the cards carefully on the dining table, one by one. The same table where Adam had done his high school algebra, where his father once carved a tiny nick while cutting wood for a science project. The light hit the edge of the gold lettering, and for a second, I saw both of them, the boy who used to fall asleep over homework, and the man who had always promised, "We'll give him a better start than we had." I ran my hand over the paper. It wasn't pride I felt then. It was distance. Later that afternoon, I drove downtown to deliver the invitations to the post office. The clerk behind the counter smiled as she weighed each stack. "Beautiful set," she said. "Must be a big event." "It is," I replied. "My son's wedding." She gave me a warm look, unaware that I didn't have a return address on the envelopes. They all carried the Livingston family's crest, a stylized L, shimmering in gold. There wasn't a single sign of me anywhere on them. On my way home, I stopped at a cafe off King Street. I ordered a small coffee and sat by the window, watching tourists stroll past the art galleries. The harbor breeze smelled faintly of salt and jasmine. I should have felt content, but something in my chest wouldn't settle. I thought of Adam's fiancée, how her father owned 3 apartment complexes and a marina, how her mother spoke with the soft, polished accent of Charleston's old families. They'd welcomed Adam in perfectly, though I sometimes wondered if they even remembered he came from North Maple Street, not the Battery. When I got home, the answering machine blinked red. Adam's voice played through the speaker. "Hey, Mom!" Claire's parents loved the invitations. "They said you have great taste." "Thank you again." There was a pause. Then a quick, almost offhanded addition. "We'll talk soon. Okay. There's something Dad Livingston wants to ask you." The message ended. I stood in the quiet kitchen, the late light slanting across the counter, touching the unopened bills stacked neatly by the sink. Something about the way he'd said "ask you" stayed with me. Not "we'd like to share," or "we need your help." Just "ask you." I turned off the machine and stared at the still surface of the counter, feeling the faint tremor of an unease I couldn't yet name outside. The church bells from St. Philip's rang for evening service. I listened until the last note faded, then folded my hands on the table and waited for the sound of the phone to ring again. The call came 2 days later, just after noon. The sun was sharp through the kitchen window, cutting across the counter where the box from the invitation still sat, half empty, like a reminder I hadn't yet decided what to do with. The phone rang with that old, steady sound, one of the few things in this house that hadn't changed in 30 years. I wiped my hands on a dish towel and answered. Mrs. Carraway. The voice was deep, measured, the kind that had spent decades giving orders and being obeyed. This is Richard Livingston, Claire's father. For a moment, I thought I'd misheard. I'd met him once, at a dinner months earlier. He'd shaken my hand and smiled without really looking at me, the way people do when they've already decided who you are. Good afternoon, Mr. Livingston, I said. What a surprise. Well, he began, his tone smooth as a polished floor. I just wanted to personally thank you for the invitations. They're exquisite. My wife was quite impressed. I waited, sensing the pause that meant there was more coming. He cleared his throat lightly. That said, I wanted to have a quick word about the wedding itself. You see, the guest list has become quite extensive. The press may even be their local society pages, that sort of thing. I said nothing. I could hear the faint rustle of papers in the background. Perhaps a schedule or a list of names he deemed important. And while we're thrilled Adam is part of our family, he continued, we do want to ensure that the event reflects a certain harmony of presentation. You understand, of course. I'm not sure I do, I said quietly. There was a short laugh, friendly, but not sincere. Oh, nothing at all to worry about. It's simply that Charleston society can be particular. Appearances matter here. The photographers, the donors, the business partners. Well, they all notice things. What sort of things, I asked. The way families fit together, he said, as though explaining something obvious. Sometimes less visibility is better for everyone involved. Perhaps for appearances. It might be best if you kept a low profile during the ceremony. Maybe skip the front rows. Avoid too much conversation with the press. He said it like a suggestion, but it felt like a verdict. I rested my hand on the edge of the counter. The porcelain was cool beneath my palm. I thought of my late husband, of how proud he would have been to see Adam in a tuxedo, walking down an aisle, of how much he'd worked so his son would never feel small. I see, I said, keeping my voice steady, a low profile, only for the sake of the occasion. He added, too quickly. These things can be delicate, you know. Different circles, different expectations, different kinds of people, I said. Finishing the sentence for him, he hesitated, then chuckled again, softer this time. You have a way of putting things plainly, Mrs. Carraway. That's admirable. Anyway, we're all very grateful for your generosity. You've been tremendously helpful. The rehearsal dinner well? I assume Adam mentioned we'd love for you to host it. It would mean so much to the family. The words sank in slowly, one by one. He wasn't calling to invite me into the celebration. He was calling to assign me a task to decorate the part of the picture where I wasn't allowed to appear. I agreed. Because that's what mothers do. Because saying no would have felt like breaking something that was already cracked. When I hung up, the house was still, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. I stood there for a long time, my hand still resting on the phone, outside. The afternoon light had turned harsh. The magnolia tree in the yard shimmered white against the sky. Its blossoms perfect, unblemished, unreachable. That night, sleep stayed far from me. I turned off the lamp around 10, but the shadows of the room felt too awake to rest. The house was quiet, the kind of silence that comes from years of living alone, broken only by the steady tick of the old clock on the mantel. I lay there, watching the faint glow of the streetlight slide across the ceiling, and thought about the last time Adam had called me Mama. He must have been 17, about to leave for college. I'd been so proud, packing his things in cardboard boxes, labeling every one of them in my careful handwriting. When he hugged me goodbye at the Charleston bus station, I'd told him, "Don't forget where you came from." He'd smiled, distracted, already looking ahead. After his father died, I'd promised myself I wouldn't let money dictate our lives. I took extra shifts at the accounting firm bookkeeping for restaurants during the day, reconciling ledgers for a local charity at night. I'd come home past midnight, the house smelling faintly of coffee and paper. There were years when I couldn't afford to fix the porch steps or replace the rusted fence, but I paid every bill on time. Adam never knew what I gave up to make his tuition deadlines. I never told him that I'd sold my wedding ring to cover his first semester housing. When he graduated, he called to tell me about his job offer in Atlanta. "It's a finance firm, Mom," he said proudly. Real clients, real money. I'd smiled through tears, telling him how proud his father would have been. I didn't tell him that I'd kept working past retirement age to help him buy his first condo. Now, years later, hearing Richard Livingston's voice replay in my head, I realized Adam had found something money couldn't buy: acceptance from people who spoke a different language of belonging. He'd started dressing like them, talking like them, spending weekends at their country homes, and somehow, the woman who'd spent decades holding him up had become the one he was embarrassed to introduce. I rose from bed and went to the window. The street outside was empty, washed pale under the lamplight. I thought of Adam as a boy, chasing fireflies across this same lawn, laughing, barefoot, calling for me to watch. I had built his world out of small, steady things: care, patience, sacrifice. And now he was building a new one where I didn't fit. The night passed like that, no anger, just a deep, aching quiet that settled in my bones. When the first light touched the horizon, I was still at the window, watching Charleston wake, wondering how something so beautiful could feel so far away. By morning, the decision had already settled inside me like a stone dropped into deep water. The anger had burned itself out during the night, leaving only clarity, cool, deliberate, and steady. The sky outside was washed clean by dawn, the harbor light turning the windows pale gold. I brewed a pot of coffee and sat at the kitchen table, the phone beside me, a notepad open. My handwriting was still precise, the same script I'd used in ledgers for 40 years. I wrote 3 names: Benjamin, Maurice, Martha, my lawyer, my banker, the event coordinator from the country club, 3 people who had managed parts of my life in quiet, professional ways. The first call was to Benjamin Crane, my attorney. He'd handled my late husband's estate and my own affairs since then. When he answered, his voice was calm and familiar. "Evelyn," he said, "it's early. Everything all right?" "Yes," I replied. "But I need to make a few changes." I explained, in simple terms, what I wanted: to remove Adam from the will entirely and redirect the funds to the Charleston Children's Cancer Trust, a foundation my husband once donated to. Benjamin hesitated. "Are you certain that's a serious decision?" "I've never been more certain," I said. "You'll find the paperwork in my file. I'll sign whatever you need by this afternoon." He sighed, not in judgment, but in quiet respect. "I'll prepare the revisions." The second call was to Maurice Turner, the branch manager at First Coastal Bank. He'd known me since my first mortgage. Always polite, always discreet. "Good morning, Mrs. Carraway," he said warmly. "Morning, Maurice. I need to freeze my son's supplemental cards and cancel 2 linked accounts. Effective immediately." He paused, caught off guard. "May I ask if this is temporary?" "No." I said, "Permanent." There was a small silence. The kind that comes when someone realizes the conversation isn't just about numbers. "I'll take care of it," he said quietly. "You'll receive confirmation within the hour." The third call took more effort. I scrolled through my phone until I found the contact for Martha Graves. Events coordinator, Magnolia Hall. Her voice came cheerful and brisk, the tone of someone used to smoothing out chaos. Mrs. Carraway. How lovely to hear from you. Everything's coming together beautifully for your son's wedding. I'm sure it is. I said, that's what I'm calling about. The payments for the venue and catering were charged to my personal card. I'd like to dispute them. A pause longer than expected. Dispute them. Yes. Those charges were made under the assumption that I would be attending the event. Circumstances have changed. She cleared her throat softly. I understand. You'll want to initiate a cancellation through your bank. Then I already have. I said, you'll receive formal notice today. When the last call ended, I sat back in my chair, the sunlight warming my hands. There was no rush of satisfaction, no sense of triumph, just the quiet order of things returning to their rightful balance. I poured myself another cup of coffee and watched a small tugboat move slowly across the harbor, steady and sure in its direction. Sometimes justice didn't shout. Sometimes it simply arrived, one measured call at a time. The morning of the wedding rose bright and sharp, sunlight spilling through the lace curtains and painting thin gold lines across the floorboards. Charleston in May always felt like a promise, magnolias in bloom, the air heavy with salt and sweetness. I moved through the house slowly, careful, almost ceremonial, as if preparing for something sacred rather than what waited ahead. On the dresser lay the navy blue dress I'd chosen weeks before. Not new, but clean, pressed, dignified. I pinned my hair up, dabbed a touch of powder, and reached for the small silver cufflinks my husband once wore to church on Easter mornings. I'd had them polished years ago, though I'd never found a reason to wear them until now. They felt cool and solid between my fingers, like memory made metal. When I fastened them to the edge of my sleeves, I caught my reflection in the mirror. The woman looking back at me was calm, too calm. Perhaps there were lines around her mouth, not from frowning, but from holding her peace too often. Behind that stillness, a flicker of something stronger waited, something like resolve. I locked the door behind me and stepped into the sunlight. The city was already awake, carriages clattering down Meeting Street, church bells echoing in the distance, tourists walking in slow, lazy pairs. I drove through it all, past the familiar turns, the park where Adam learned to ride his bike, the coffee shop where I'd once waited for his college acceptance letter. Every street felt like a chapter closing quietly behind me. The road to Magnolia Hall curved along the edge of the river. Wide oaks draped in Spanish moss, casting soft shadows across the asphalt. My hands stayed steady on the wheel, the same way they used to when I balanced books under flickering office lights. Precision had always been my strength, and now it was my shield. I reached the gates just before noon. The guard recognized me, his face flickering with the polite confusion of someone told one thing and seeing another. "Good morning, Mrs. Carraway," he said, hesitating only slightly before opening the gate. Inside, the lawns stretched immaculate and green, the kind of perfection that costs more than it's worth. I parked near the edge of the lot, turned off the engine, and sat for a moment, the hum of cicadas filling the silence. My pulse was steady, my breath even, dignity that was all I had left to carry, and I carried it like armor. Then I opened the door, stepped into the sunlight, and began walking toward the hall. The front entrance of Magnolia Hall shimmered beneath the Charleston sun, all white columns and trailing ivy. Music floated faintly from inside violins. Soft laughter, the polite hum of a world I had helped pay for, but was never meant to enter. Cars lined the circular drive like ornaments, black and gleaming. I could see women in pastel dresses stepping out, men straightening their ties, the soft flash of camera lenses catching the moment. I smoothed my skirt before walking up the steps. The marble was warm under my palms when I touched the railing, the same pale cream as the envelope I'd held weeks ago, near the doors. A pair of ushers in matching suits stood with guest lists, offering courteous smiles that faltered when they saw me. I didn't blame them. They weren't sure what to do with someone who didn't quite belong. Then I heard my name, Mom. Adam stood a few feet away, just beyond the archway, his jacket unbuttoned, a bead of sweat at his temple. He looked handsome, in that composed way he had learned from the Livingstons' broad shoulders, crisp collar, shoes polished enough to see your reflection. For a moment, I simply looked at him. My son, the same boy who used to run barefoot through the backyard shouting that one day he'd build me a house bigger than this one. Adam, I said softly, you look wonderful. He glanced toward the ushers, then back at me. You shouldn't have come this early, he murmured. His voice was polite but strained, rehearsed. We were going to call. I wanted to see you before the ceremony, I said, to wish you well. He shifted his weight, looking everywhere but at me. Mom, he began, the word barely above a whisper. Please don't make this harder. The air around us seemed to thin. Behind him, I could see the glimmer of chandeliers, white linens, guests already finding their seats. The scent of magnolias drifted through the open doors. I don't understand, I said. He exhaled, as if bracing for a blow. It's just, Claire's family, they think it might be better if you didn't come in. For appearances. There's been a lot of attention, photographers and all that. They don't want confusion. He said the last word carefully, like it could be mistaken for kindness. I felt the words land, slow and heavy, each one finding its mark. Confusion, I repeated. You mean me? He closed his eyes briefly. Mom, it's not about you personally. It's just things have to look a certain way today. You know how people are. I looked at him then. Not the tailored suit, not the nervous hands, but the man himself, my son, standing between love and shame, unable to tell the difference. When you were 10, I said quietly, you came home from school crying because a boy said your shoes were cheap. I told you that pride doesn't come from what you wear, it comes from how you walk. I meant it then. I still do. His jaw tightened. Please don't do this here. I'm not doing anything, I said. You are... A few guests were beginning to glance our way. I could feel the weight of their curiosity, the polite discomfort of people who know they're watching something they shouldn't. He lowered his voice. Mom, please, just go home. I'll come by after the honeymoon. I promise. The promise was familiar, worn thin from use. I could have argued, demanded to see the woman I'd raised him to love, reminded him that my hands had built everything he stood on, but something inside me had already gone quiet. All right, I said, if that's what you want. Relief flickered across his face, followed quickly by guilt. Thank you for understanding. I do understand, I said, and I meant it in a way he couldn't yet grasp. I reached out, straightened his tie, the smallest act of motherhood left to me. You look just like your father when you're nervous, I whispered. He gave a shaky laugh. I'll make it up to you. Of course you will, I said. I stepped back, smoothing my skirt once more. He turned toward the doors, already being greeted by the next wave of guests. For a moment, his shadow crossed mine on the marble floor, one fading as the other moved forward. I stayed there long enough to feel the warmth of the stone seep through my shoes, then turned toward the sunlight. The laughter and music followed me out onto the lawn, bright and distant, as I began to walk down the drive. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. The laughter from inside Magnolia Hall drifted faintly through the open doors, light and careless, the way it always sounds when people think they're on the right side of a story. Adam stood there in his perfect suit, looking at me like a man torn between shame and duty. I had spent my whole life preparing him to stand tall, and now he could barely meet my eyes. I exhaled slowly, the air leaving me in one steady line. The ache in my chest eased, replaced by something cooler clarity. Perhaps, or simply the end of trying. I gave him a small smile, the kind a mother gives when she's finally done explaining. "That's fine, sweetheart," I said gently, "but before I go, check your phone." His brows drew together. "My phone?" "Yes," I said, adjusting the strap of my purse on my shoulder. "You'll want to see it." He blinked, uncertain, already pulling it from his pocket. I watched the familiar glow of the screen light up his face, the way his expression shifted slightly when he saw the flood of new notifications. A frown touched his mouth, but I didn't wait for him to speak. I turned toward the long oak-lined drive that curved down to the main road. The sunlight filtered through the branches, scattering small bursts of gold across the path. My shoes sank softly into the gravel with each step. Behind me, the music swelled a string quartet, beginning the prelude, and somewhere in the distance, a voice called for more champagne. The air was thick with magnolia and salt. I could feel the stillness in my body, an odd, peaceful heaviness that came after too many years of holding my breath for someone else. My heels clicked in rhythm with the faint hum of cicadas. I didn't look back, though I could sense the weight of eyes on my back, the ushers, perhaps, or guests curious about the woman who had come and gone before the ceremony began. Let them wonder. The truth was already unfolding, quietly, efficiently, in the small device in my son's trembling hand. At the end of the drive, I paused by the iron gate, my reflection faintly visible in the dark surface of the car door. For a moment, I thought of my husband, of all the times he'd told me dignity was a kind of armor. He'd been right. I felt untouchable now, not proud, not bitter, just steady. I opened the car door, the hinges creaking softly in the heat, and slid behind the wheel. The breeze carried one last sound from the hall laughter again, brighter this time. I turned the key and let the engine purr to life. Then I drove away, leaving behind the music, the sunlight, and the son who was about to learn what silence could do. Adam stared at the screen, the glow lighting his face with a pale, unnatural color. For a second, he didn't move. The sound of his phone vibrating filled the space between us, the sharp buzz of one notification after another, then another, then another. His hand trembled slightly as he scrolled, eyes darting across the messages that began piling up like a sudden storm he couldn't outrun. I was already halfway down the steps by then, though I could still hear the faint chime of his ringtone echoing through the open doors. Inside, the world he'd worked so hard to impress was moving in perfect rhythm. A quartet played under the chandeliers. Guests sipped champagne, smiling at one another, blissfully unaware that the floor beneath their perfect afternoon had just started to shift. "Adam," a voice called sharply from the doorway. It was Richard Livingston, the bride's father, his expression polished and confident as always. "You're needed inside. They're ready to begin seating." Adam didn't answer. He was frozen in place, still staring at his phone. Richard frowned, the first sign of irritation breaking through his charm. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Is there a problem?" Adam finally looked up, his mouth opening, but no sound coming out. He turned the screen toward him instead. Richard glanced down, eyes narrowing. The first notification was from the bank transaction reversed. $180,000. Below it, another alert. Supplemental account closed. And then another. An email with the subject line, "Amendment to Last Will and Testament. E. Caraway." "What is this?" Richard asked. His voice clipped, a thread of disbelief running through it. Adam's throat moved as he swallowed. I don't know. It must be a mistake." Richard's phone buzzed in his own pocket. He took it out and looked at the screen. Whatever he saw made the blood drain from his face. "The club just sent me a message," he said, his tone tightening. "They're saying the payment authorization was canceled this morning. They want immediate confirmation or the event can't proceed. That's impossible." Adam stammered. She must have—" He stopped himself. Richard's eyes flicked toward the doors, then back to Adam. "Your mother." Adam said nothing. Inside the hall, the music faltered for a moment. The quartet glancing around uncertainly as the murmur of conversation grew louder. Claire appeared at the entrance then, her veil pinned perfectly, her face radiant but tense. "What's going on?" she asked, taking one look at Adam and then at her father. Richard straightened, smoothing his jacket as if posture alone could hold the situation together. "Nothing, sweetheart," he said. "A small misunderstanding with the billing. We'll sort it out." Claire looked at Adam, confused. What kind of misunderstanding? Before he could answer, the event manager, Martha Graves, hurried down the aisle toward them, a headset clutched in one hand and a clipboard in the other. Her voice carried the strained politeness of someone used to fixing other people's chaos. "Mr. Livingston, Mr. Carraway, may I speak with you both for a moment?" Richard's jaw tightened. "We're about to begin. I understand, sir, but there's a serious issue with the payment. The transaction that covered the venue, catering, and staff, it was processed under a card belonging to Mrs. Evelyn Carraway. That payment was reversed at 9:30 this morning." Silence rippled through the air like the first break of thunder. Richard blinked slowly, as though the words themselves had betrayed logic. "You mean she canceled it?" "Yes, sir. Which means we don't have an active payment for today's event. Without that, we can't legally proceed." Claire turned to Adam, color draining from her face. "You told me your family was handling it. You said everything was paid for." "It was," Adam said weakly. "It was paid." He stopped, staring down at his phone again. The notifications hadn't stopped. New messages from the attorney, the bank. Even his own credit cards declined. His world was shrinking one line at a time. Richard took a step closer, his voice now cold, stripped of all pretense. "You let me invite 300 guests to an event your mother paid for." "It wasn't supposed to be." Adam's voice cracked. "Do you have any idea what this looks like?" Martha cleared her throat softly. "Gentlemen, if the balance isn't settled within the next 30 minutes, we'll have to ask guests to vacate the hall." Claire's eyes filled with tears, her hand trembling against the lace of her bouquet. This can't be happening, but it was. The music had stopped entirely now. Guests were whispering, glancing toward the doors. Someone turned off the microphone near the stage. The murmur grew a low tide of confusion, rising toward panic. Richard pulled out his phone again, muttering something about transferring funds, but the signal in the hall was weak, and the bank held his transfer for verification. "It'll take an hour," he snapped. "Maybe 2. Martha's face softened, her professionalism fraying at the edges. "I'm so sorry, sir, but we can't delay that long." Adam rubbed his temples, his breath coming unevenly. "I'll call Mom," he said suddenly. Though the words sounded desperate even to him, he dialed. But the line rang out once, twice, and then went to voicemail. Evelyn Carraway. Her recorded voice said, calm and distant, "Please leave a message." He stood there, phone pressed to his ear, surrounded by people who had once called him promising, successful, refined. All those compliments evaporated in the humid Charleston air. Richard turned away, his expression unreadable now. "You'll fix this," he said quietly, "before anyone outside this room finds out." But the room already knew. Guests shifted uncomfortably, whispers breaking like waves. Cameras flickered as someone tried to discreetly record. Adam lowered the phone, his hand shaking. He looked toward the open doors, toward the sunlight beyond, where he had last seen me walking away under the oak trees. For the first time in years, he realized how completely I had built his world and how easily I could take it apart. Behind him, the string quartet began to pack their instruments, and the soft rustle of silk and linen filled the air as guests started to stand. The illusion was gone. The music, the wealth, the image, everything that had once made him feel untouchable, now crumbled in front of 300 silent witnesses. And outside, beyond the noise, I drove down the quiet road toward the harbor, my window half open, the wind carrying the faintest echo of violin strings, fading into the distance. 2 weeks before the wedding, Charleston sat under a heavy gray sky, the kind that pressed close to the windows and made the whole city move slower. I remember it clearly, because it was the morning I stopped waiting for Adam to call and decided to call my lawyer instead. The house felt smaller than usual. The box of invitation samples still sat on the hall table, the edges curling from the humidity. I brushed my hand over them as I passed, then picked up my phone and dialed Benjamin Crane, attorney at law. He answered on the second ring. "Evelyn," he said, warm as always. "Haven't heard from you in a while. I need to make an appointment." I told him. Today, if possible. There must have been something in my tone because he didn't ask why. "Come by at noon," he said. By 11:30, I was sitting in his office, a room that smelled faintly of cedar and old books. The blinds were half drawn, filtering the light into narrow stripes that stretched across the mahogany desk. Benjamin looked up from a stack of papers when I entered. He'd been my attorney for nearly 20 years steady, loyal, discreet. The kind of man who never asked personal questions unless they affected the paperwork. "What can I do for you?" he asked as I sat down. "I'd like to revise my will," I said. "Completely." He blinked, pen pausing above the page. "Completely." "Yes," I said, my voice even. "Remove Adam as beneficiary, transfer the estate, savings, and the investment portfolio to the Charleston Children's Cancer Trust." Benjamin studied me for a long moment. "That's not a small change." "I'm aware." He set his pen down, folding his hands. "May I ask what brought this on?" "I'm not punishing him," I said. "I'm reminding him where love came from and what respect costs when it's lost." He nodded slowly, understanding without needing more explanation. "I'll draft the amendment. You'll need to sign and have it notarized. I'll come back tomorrow," I said. When I left his office, the rain had started to fall in thin, slanted lines. The air smelled like wet earth and magnolia. I drove straight to the bank. Maurice Turner, the branch manager, greeted me by name as always. "Morning, Mrs. Caraway," he said, smiling from behind the polished counter. "What brings you in today?" "I need to make a few adjustments to my accounts," I replied, effective immediately. He led me into his small office overlooking the street. The rain streaked the glass, softening the view. What kind of adjustments? I want to remove my son's access credit cards, supplemental accounts, automatic transfers, everything in his name linked to mine. Maurice hesitated, his polite professionalism slipping just enough for concern. "Of course. But may I ask, has there been any fraud or issue of misuse?" "Nothing illegal," I said. "Just misplaced trust." He nodded slowly, tapping on his keyboard. "All right. I'll close the linked accounts and issue confirmation within 24 hours. You'll receive the revised statements by email." When he was done, he stood and extended his hand. "For what it's worth," he said, "I've always admired how you manage things. Quietly, but firmly. Quiet is the only way I know," I replied. I left the bank and drove toward the harbor, parking near the old pier where Adam used to fish with his father. The rain had turned to mist, blurring the water until the horizon disappeared. I sat there for a while, engine off, hands folded in my lap. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel cruel. I didn't feel... What I felt Was finality a clean, still kind of certainty that comes when you stop waiting to be seen and start acting on what you already know? By the time I turned the car back toward home, the rain had lifted. Charleston's sky was opening again, the light returning in thin, careful stripes like a ledger balanced after too many years of loss. Inside Magnolia Hall, everything gleamed: the glass chandeliers, the ivory-draped tables, the towering floral arrangements that perfumed the air with magnolia and roses. Guests moved in graceful currents. Glasses of champagne balanced in manicured hands, the low hum of conversation rising beneath the steady strains of a string quartet. At the center of it all stood Adam and Claire, poised on the edge of their carefully staged perfection. The photographer circled them, snapping frame after frame while the videographer adjusted his lights, murmuring about capturing the right glow. The glow, however, was beginning to flicker. At first, it was a whisper, a quick exchange between two waiters near the back. Then a woman in a headset appeared beside the bar, speaking urgently into a walkie-talkie. A manager in a dark blazer followed, his expression composed but strained. He spoke to the musicians, who stopped mid-note. The pause stretched longer than it should have, the kind of silence people notice only when it feels wrong. "Is something happening?" Claire asked, her smile faltering as she glanced toward her father. Richard Livingston had already seen the manager approaching. His jaw tightened, and for the first time that afternoon, his charm dimmed. "Stay calm," he murmured to his daughter. "It's probably nothing." But it wasn't nothing. The manager, Mr. Harland, a man who had spent 20 years ensuring Charleston's most exclusive events unfolded without a single flaw, walked up the aisle between the tables. He carried a folded sheet of paper in his hand and stopped near the small stage. His voice quiet, but carrying through the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began. "I apologize for the interruption, but there's been a payment issue we need to resolve before proceeding with the ceremony." Conversations broke off mid-sentence. The room shifted, chairs creaked, glasses clicked against tables. Someone's laughter died halfway through. Richard stepped forward, his voice low, but edged with authority. "There must be a mistake." Mr. Harland inclined his head politely. "The payment for today's event was processed through an account under Mrs. Evelyn Caraway. That transaction has been reversed." A pulse of silence rippled through the room, then broke into soft murmurs. Claire blinked, uncomprehending. "What do you mean? Reversed?" "It means," Harland said gently, "that the funds are no longer available. The venue, catering, and service staff are currently unpaid. Until that's resolved, we cannot continue." Someone near the back gasped. Another guest whispered, "Reversed by who?" Richard's face darkened, the calm polish of his reputation slipping. "I'll handle this," he snapped, signaling for his assistant, who hurried toward him with a tablet. He turned to Adam. "Why was this in your mother's name?" Adam looked lost, his voice barely audible. She wanted to help. It was supposed to be temporary." "Temporary?" Richard's voice rose. "Do you have any idea what you've done, Richard?" His wife murmured sharply, placing a hand on his arm. "Lower your voice." But it was too late. The whispers were spreading like fire. Guests leaned toward one another, curiosity overtaking politeness. The hum of scandal began to swell beneath the surface elegance of the room. Claire turned to Adam, her hands trembling slightly against the lace of her gown. "Please tell me this isn't true." He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. The photographer, sensing the tension, lowered his camera. The musicians exchanged uncertain glances. The servers froze mid-step, unsure whether to keep pouring champagne or quietly retreat. Richard looked to the event manager. "How much time do we have to fix this? 15 minutes. "Perhaps 20, Harland replied carefully. "After that, we'll have to close the hall." "I'm sorry, sir. Club policy." Richard's assistant whispered something into his ear, holding up the tablet. Richard swore under his breath. The transfer isn't going through. The bank's requiring secondary authorization. Then call them. Claire said urgently. I am calling, he snapped. Turning away, one hand pressed to his phone. Meanwhile, the buzz in the room grew louder. A woman in pearls whispered, Did you hear the groom's mother canceled everything? Another said, All this talk about old Charleston money seems it wasn't theirs after all. Adam's face had gone pale, his tie slightly askew. The weight of realization hit him with a force he couldn't disguise. Every detail, the flowers, the music, the imported linens, even the champagne had been bought with money that wasn't his, belonging to the woman standing outside under the sun. He reached for his phone again, fingers fumbling as he tried to call me. No answer. The call went to voicemail. My calm, recorded voice saying, Please leave a message. He tried again. Still nothing. Claire's tears were starting to smudge the edges of her makeup. This isn't happening, she whispered. We can't just cancel. Everyone's here. Her father turned from the phone, face set. Pride hardening into fury. If this doesn't get fixed, we're leaving. You can explain this disaster to the press yourself. Dad, please. But the manager was already speaking again. I'm sorry, Mr. Livingston, but without verified payment, we must ask guests to vacate the ballroom. The string quartet began to pack up. Chairs scraped against the marble floor as the murmur became a low roar. Some guests stood awkwardly. Others reached for their phones to record what was happening. The photographer, uncertain whether to keep filming, slowly lowered his camera and turned away. Richard barked into his phone, demanding an immediate transfer. But the signal inside the old hall was weak. His assistant stepped outside to find a stronger connection, tripping over cables as he went. In the midst of the chaos, Adam stood frozen. The image of the confident, successful groom had vanished, replaced by a man stripped bare before the very people he'd wanted to impress. Claire clutched her bouquet, looking at him as if she no longer recognized who he was. Did you know she was going to do this? She asked. He shook his head helplessly. No, I thought she wouldn't. She just did, Richard said bitterly. The hall was unraveling fast. The murmurs had become a current of judgment that moved from table to table. Someone laughed softly, a sound too sharp to be kind. The word embarrassing floated across the air. And through it all, Adam's phone kept buzzing bank alerts. Legal notices, confirmations, each one a reminder that the foundation of his perfect life had been built entirely on borrowed love and quiet generosity. He stared at the screen one last time before letting the phone fall to his side. The sound of it hitting the marble floor was small, but in that vast, echoing room, it carried farther than any voice. The music had stopped. The laughter was gone. All that remained was the hollow sound of footsteps as guests began to leave, their conversations rising in murmured waves of disbelief. At the far end of the hall, the double doors stood open, sunlight spilling in like judgment. And somewhere beyond those doors, down the oak-lined drive, I was already gone. The sound of approaching footsteps broke through the hum of the cicadas. I had parked beneath the oak trees at the edge of the drive, the afternoon sun slanting through the branches, when I saw Richard Livingston striding toward me, his polished shoes scuffed against the gravel, his jacket half-buttoned, tie loosened. Even in fury, he carried himself like a man used to being obeyed. Mrs. Carroway, he called out sharply, don't you walk away from me. I closed the car door and turned to face him. The breeze caught the edge of his words, carrying the scent of his cologne strong, expensive, overpowering. His face was flushed, not just from the heat, but from humiliation. Behind him, the faint chaos of Magnolia Hall drifted into the open air, voices raised, chairs scraping, the dull clatter of a world unraveling. "You humiliated my family," he said, stopping a few feet away. 300 guests, half of Charleston society, watching my daughter's wedding fall apart because of you. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" I looked at him calmly. "I imagine you do," I said. He blinked, thrown off by my tone. "You think this is some kind of victory? You've made a fool of yourself as much as of us." I didn't raise my voice. I said quietly, "I didn't throw a scene. I didn't have to." He took a step closer, his voice rising. "You wanted attention. That's what this is. A bitter, jealous woman." "Careful," I interrupted, my voice still even. "You're mistaking me for someone who cares what you think." For a moment, he stared at me. Speechless, I took a slow breath, the air thick with the scent of magnolia and dust. "You mistook my silence for weakness," I said. "Today, you learned the cost of that mistake." His jaw tightened. "You ruined your own son's wedding." "No," I said. "I ended a performance I was never meant to applaud." He laughed, short and bitter. "Do you have any idea what you've destroyed? That young man's reputation, my daughter's future, our name." "Your name," I repeated softly. "That's all this was ever about." He opened his mouth to respond, but stopped when he saw my expression calm, unshaken, a kind of peace he didn't understand. "I paid for everything you paraded in there," I said. "The hall, the flowers, the food, the illusion, all bought with the same hands you dismissed as unworthy. I built a life from nothing. Mr. Livingston, I know what real value looks like. You've only ever rented yours, for the first time." Something flickered in his eyes, uncertainty, perhaps even a hint of shame. But pride, that old and stubborn thing, came back quick. "You'll regret this," he said. "People will talk." "They already do," I said. "The difference is, they finally know the truth." He stared at me for a long moment, his breath coming fast, his shoulders tight. Then, without another word, he turned on his heel and started back toward the hall. His shoes left small imprints in the dust, perfect and temporary, already beginning to fade in the breeze. I watched him go until the sound of his footsteps disappeared behind the trees. The sunlight had shifted, warm against my face, and for the first time all day, I felt light. I got into the car, started the engine, and let the hum fill the silence he'd left behind. Ahead, the road curved gently toward the harbor, where the sky had begun to open into color. I rolled down the window, the air cool on my skin, and drove forward without looking back. By the time the sun began to slip lower across the harbor, the story had already started to spread. Charleston has a way of carrying news. It drifts through cafe chatter, over garden fences, through the narrow brick alleys that remember everything. I wasn't surprised. In a city built on appearances, a wedding collapsing in front of 300 guests was a feast that no one could resist. But what none of them knew, not yet, was the truth about the money. I stopped by the small office I still kept downtown, a quiet space above a florist shop on King Street. The room smelled faintly of lilies and ink. I hadn't used the office much since retiring, but I'd kept it as a place to think. The framed certificates on the wall were yellowed around the edges. CPA license, corporate management certifications, old awards for financial excellence from years I rarely spoke about. Most people, including Adam, thought I'd been a simple bookkeeper. That was the version of my life I'd allowed them to believe: small, modest, unthreatening. It was easier that way. Easier for men like Richard Livingston to underestimate me. Easier for my son to imagine he was the one rising above his mother's station. In truth, I hadn't just balanced ledgers for small businesses. For nearly 3 decades, I'd managed the investment portfolios of several marine logistics and shipping companies across the Southeast. I'd built a network of clients who trusted me more than they trusted their own boards. Quietly, carefully, I invested my commissions and bonuses into municipal bonds, long-term dividends, and later into Charleston real estate old houses no one wanted until the city decided to call them historic. By the time I retired, the value of my holdings had grown into 7 figures. I never flaunted it. I never bought new cars or joined country clubs. My satisfaction had always come from knowing I could stand on my own if the world ever tried to push me aside. When Adam began dating Claire, I'd seen the Livingstons for what they were: elegant, practiced, the kind of people who equated worth with reputation. They didn't ask about my life, only whether I'd be contributing to the engagement party fund. I remember Richard's handshake the night we met, firm but distant, as though sealing a transaction rather than greeting a person. I played my part. I smiled, wrote checks, and stayed quiet. I wanted my son to have his happiness, even if it meant pretending not to see what he was trading for it. But as the wedding grew larger and the costs mounted, I began to understand what I had truly been funding: not love, but an illusion of status. Every cent spent on the imported linens, the orchestras, the open bar had come from accounts with my name alone. The Livingstons had not contributed $1. When I canceled the payments, it wasn't out of vengeance. It was truth correcting itself. That afternoon, after Richard had confronted me and the chaos of the hall had faded behind me, I sat in that small office. The ledgers spread open before me. Numbers have a way of stripping things bare. They don't lie. They don't flatter. They simply tell you where things stand. I flipped through the files: bank statements, property deeds, stock summaries, and felt a calm satisfaction settle over me. Not pride exactly, but proof. Every late night, every overtime hour, every weekend I'd worked while Adam slept late or went out with friends. It was all there, written in numbers that would outlive any wedding announcement. People like Richard Livingston measured power by what could be seen: houses, suits, the names printed on invitations. I'd built mine quietly, line by line, until it was strong enough to outlast them all. I closed the folders, turned off the lamp, and stood by the window. Below, the city pulsed with life, the lights flickering on one by one, car horns echoing faintly from the street. Somewhere out there, my son was beginning to understand that everything he'd built had rested on foundations I'd laid long before he learned to sign his own name. I locked the office and stepped into the evening air. The city smelled of salt and rain, the first stars glinting faintly above the steeples. It wasn't triumph I felt. It was release, the quiet, steady kind that comes when the truth finally belongs to no one but you. It was nearly dusk when Adam came to the house. The same silver sedan he'd driven since college pulled into the driveway, stopping at an angle like it had so many times before. I was sitting on the porch, a cup of tea cooling beside me, when I heard the door slam. He didn't knock. He just stood there at the bottom of the steps, tie loosened, face drawn. The soft light caught the edge of his eyes, and for a moment, I saw the boy he used to be, the one who once brought me wildflowers from the yard and left them in an old mason jar by the kitchen sink. "Mom," he said, his voice unsteady. I didn't move. "You look tired." He climbed the steps slowly, his polished shoes dull now, streaked with dust from the drive. "You planned this," he said, not accusing, not even angry. The words came out hollow, as if he'd already rehearsed them 100 times. "No," I said. "You did." He blinked. "What do you mean?" I set the cup down and folded my hands in my lap. "You planned it the moment you let them decide who I was. When you nodded along while they erased me from your story. When you stood by and called it for appearances." He opened his mouth, but couldn't find words. The silence stretched between us, heavy but not cruel. "They told me it was better if you stayed outside," he said finally. "You thought it would be easier to let me disappear I finished for him. He lowered his head, his voice breaking. I didn't think it would go that far. I studied him quietly, the man my son had become. His hands, once steady, were shaking slightly. You weren't cruel, Adam, I said softly, just silent, and silence, when it comes from love, can still destroy. He sat down on the porch step beside me, his shoulders collapsing under the weight of understanding. I don't know how to fix it, he whispered. Then don't, I said. Not yet. Sit with it. Feel what it costs. He nodded, eyes shining in the fading light. The cicadas had started their slow chorus, filling the quiet between us. After a while, he said, they're saying terrible things online. About me. About you. People talk, I said. They always have. The truth will settle when it's ready. He looked out toward the street, the evening stretching long and golden. I didn't just lose them. Did I? No, I said gently. You lost the version of yourself they built. Now you'll have to find your own. He turned to me, his face open, raw with remorse. I'm sorry, Mom. I reached for his hand, the gesture small but enough. I know, I said. That's a start. The porch light flickered on above us, catching the outline of his face, for the first time in a long while. There was no distance left between us, only the fragile quiet of two people learning how to begin again. By the time the last of the guests began to leave Magnolia Hall, the sky over Charleston had turned the color of pale amber. The air carried that strange quiet that follows disaster. No shouting, no chaos, just the low murmur of disbelief that lingers after something beautiful collapses in public view. From the road beyond the iron gates, I could see them through the open doors, servers stacking untouched plates, flowers wilting under the weight of the evening heat, white tablecloths rippling softly in the breeze. A few guests lingered near the entrance, whispering as they scrolled through their phones. The hum of conversation rose, then fell again, like waves losing strength before reaching shore. I waited until the crowd began to thin. Cars pulled away one by one, their taillights flickering red against the fading light. Claire stood by her father's side, her veil gone, her face pale beneath the heavy makeup. She looked like a ghost of the bride she had been that morning. Adam was nowhere in sight. I started the car, the old engine humming to life. The air coming through the window smelled faintly of river salt and magnolia. The noise from the hall grew distant, swallowed by the evening. As I drove along the curve of the Ashley River, the sun slipped behind the trees, scattering gold across the water. The reflections wavered like small fires trying to hold on before darkness came. The city lights began to flicker in the distance, steady and familiar. For the first time in weeks, my chest felt light. No pride, no anger, just quiet. The kind that comes when everything false has finally burned away. When I reached the old bridge, I slowed the car and let the wind rush in through both windows. The sound of it filled the cabin, a wild, soothing roar. My hair lifted in the breeze, the scent of the river washing through every corner. Behind me, Magnolia Hall was just another building fading into twilight. Ahead, Charleston glowed honest, imperfect, alive. I pressed my hand against the wheel, steady and unhurried, and drove on toward home, the road open and forgiving beneath the fading sun. The winter in Charleston had been mild, the kind that never quite settled into cold. By February, the azaleas were already starting to bloom again along the edge of the porch. I had grown used to the quiet, the rhythm of days marked by the soft clatter of teacups, the hum of the radio, the sound of my own footsteps moving through rooms that finally felt like mine. It had been 6 months since the wedding that never happened. 6 months since Adam's name had last appeared in a headline. The gossip had faded. As all things do, Charleston found new stories to whisper about, and the city went on pretending nothing had happened. I didn't expect to hear from him again, not yet. At least, the phone rang one Sunday morning as I was watering the small garden by the steps. I almost didn't answer, but the sound carried a persistence that felt familiar. "Hi, Mom," he said when I picked up. His voice was softer than I remembered, slower. "Adam," I said quietly. "How are you?" "I'm good," he said, then paused. "Actually, I'm getting there. I found an apartment. It's small, but it's mine. I'm working full-time now at a logistics firm downtown. Pays well enough to keep the lights on." I smiled to myself, picturing him in some modest corner of the city, learning how to build something on his own. "That sounds like a start." "It is," he said. I could hear him exhale, a faint tremor in his breath. Claire and I called it off for good. I think we both knew it wouldn't work. Not after everything. There was a quiet stretch between us, filled only by the sound of wind through the line. "Mom," he said finally, his voice steady but low. "I never thanked you. Not just for what you did, though, I guess that too, but for stopping me before I became someone I couldn't recognize." I leaned against the porch railing, feeling the air shift with the weight of his words. "I didn't stop you, Adam," I said softly. "You stopped yourself." He laughed once, the sound small but real. "Maybe. Still, thank you." I hesitated, then said, "I'm proud of you finally." The silence that followed was warm this time, full of something neither of us needed to name. Outside. The wind rustled through the azaleas, their pink blooms trembling gently in the light. A week after our call, I found the pocket watch sitting in the top drawer of my desk. It had belonged to my husband's silver, slightly tarnished, the kind that needed winding by hand. I hadn't touched it in years. When I held it again, it still carried a faint trace of engine oil and cedar, the scent of the man who'd worn it every day of his working life. He used to say, time was the only thing we couldn't earn back. I never understood the weight of that truth until the years began to catch up with me. Now, turning the watch in my hand, I realized it had waited long enough to belong to someone else. I found a small box and wrapped it carefully, layering soft tissue around the watch as if it were something fragile enough to break. On top, I placed a note written in my careful, deliberate hand. "Wear this when you learn the value of time and the people who gave it to you." At the post office, the clerk asked if it was valuable. "It is," I said, "but not in the way you think." The package left my hands easily. I watched as the postal worker placed it in the outgoing bin, disappearing among a dozen others headed in every direction outside. The afternoon light was bright and forgiving. That evening, I sat on the porch and listened to the low hum of the city settling into dusk. Somewhere out there, Adam was building a quieter life, one made not of appearances, but of effort. He would open the box soon, maybe tonight, maybe in a week, and find more than just a watch inside. He would find time returning to him, steady and patient, ready to begin again. The evening he came back, the air over Charleston carried the scent of rain. The sky was soft gray, and the azaleas along the front steps had begun to close for the night. I heard his car pull up before I saw him, a quiet hum, then the sound of a door shutting gently, as though he was afraid to disturb the calm. When I opened the door, Adam was standing on the porch, holding a small paper bag and a half smile. "Coffee," he said, "from that place on King Street you like." I let the door swing wider. You remembered. Inside, the house was warm, filled with the faint aroma of cinnamon and old wood. We sat in the kitchen, the same table where he'd once done his homework, where his father and I had planned the years we thought would never end. He poured the coffee into 2 mismatched mugs and passed one to me. For a long while, neither of us spoke. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence anymore, just full, familiar. He told me about his job, about the long hours and the satisfaction of earning something that was finally his. I listened, smiling at the small pride in his voice, the kind that came from effort, not inheritance. At one point, he looked around the kitchen, tracing the lines of the wallpaper with his eyes. "It's strange," he said. "Everything looks smaller than I remember. You've grown." I said simply. He laughed quietly. The sound was softer now, steadier. When it was time for him to go, he stood by the doorway, hesitating for a moment. "Thanks for the coffee," he said, "and for not giving up on me." I didn't give up. I told him, "I just waited for you to see." He nodded, and before leaving, leaned down to kiss my forehead, a small gesture, but enough to bridge everything that had once been broken. After he drove away, I stepped out onto the porch. The street was quiet, the air cool against my skin. I reached for the old switch beside the door, the one my husband had wired years ago, and turned on the porch light. Its glow spread softly across the yard, warm and steady. I watched it for a moment and whispered, "This light isn't for waiting anymore. It's for peace."